Welcome all to our evening discussion, Princeton-Bucharest seminar in early modern philosophy. It should be meeting 14, I think, or something like this, which I'm going to moderate. And the title of the panel is Reason, Passions, and Law in Hobbes and Spinoza. We're having 3 speakers. The first speaker to go is Claudia Dumitru, and her title is Equality and Private Judgment in Hobbes' State of Nature. Claudia, you have the floor.
Okay, well, thank you. I think it is customary to thank the organizers. I think they're doing a terrific job. I am going to try to share my screen. I'm not sure how this will play with YouTube. And I'm also going to ask everyone to mute their microphones before I do that, so that we don't have... Can everyone see this?
Yes.
Yes.
Oh, wait. Okay, here we go. Right. So I'm going to be talking about a bundle of issues that have to do with who gets to judge in the state of nature. I propose that we start with just a very short primer on the state of nature. I think most people are aware of the main tenets of the Hobbesian state of nature, but just to make sure. Right? So as you all probably know, the state of nature is a state outside of civil society, and Hobbes is using this device to infer what would happen given human nature, right? And one of the first premises he posits in all 3 accounts of the state of nature he gives in his 3 texts, Elements of Law, the Kyue, and Leviathan, is that men are by nature equal. And that they all have, by natural right, the liberty to employ any means necessary for their self-preservation. And moreover, they are going to be the judge of what means are actually necessary for self-preservation. This situation of equality and unlimited liberty to use their faculties will lead to a war of all against all. I'm not going to go into many details about how this arises. It's fairly known. He thinks that people are going to fight by competition when they both want the same means for self-preservation. This will be for gain. Some of them are going to fight for safety to defend themselves against others, and others are going to fight for reputation. These are people who are motivated by glory, right? And this will lead to a stage of generalized war. And the only way out of this state, the only proper way out of the state, there might be de facto ways out of it, is through following the laws of nature, which he redefines to be theorems of reason tending to self-preservation. Right, so the main law of nature would be to seek peace, and then you have a bunch of conditional. Then you have a bunch of conditional imperatives tending to self-preservation. Right, and I'm going to focus on this one aspect here: the fact that every man is a judge of what means are necessary for self-preservation. And I'm going to be looking in the first part of my presentation at an argument by Reductio, which he sketches in Elements of Law and the Kyue, and abandons in the Leviathan. I'm not entirely sure if the abandoning of this argument is significant, but I think that the argument does do something interesting from my perspective in connecting natural equality and epistemic standing. Right? Wait, for some reason, okay, here we go. So this is what I call an argument from epistemic symmetry, and I'm going to read it out. You have here the version from the Kyue. So now, whether the means which he, man in his natural state, is about to use, and the action he's performing be necessary to the preservation of his life and members or not, he himself by the right of nature must be judged. For if it be contrary to right reason that I should judge of my own peril, say that another man is judge. Why now? Because he judged of what concerns me. By the same reason, because we are equal by nature, will I judge also of things which do belong to him. Therefore, it agrees with right reason, that is, it is the right of nature, that I judge of his opinion, that is, whether it conduces to my preservation or not, right? So this argument is basically in the same form in the Elements of Law as well. You have it on the left. The only addition is here in yellow, making explicit the fact that the reasoning proceeds by the acknowledgement of natural equality, right? And I'm going to reconstruct the argument if my PowerPoint works. Here we go. Right? So just putting it in quick premise conclusion form, it is a reductio. We'll assume I'm not the judge of things that concern me. If I'm not the judge of things that concern me, then another man is. Notice that there are some assumptions to unpack about this particular step. So from 1 and 2, another man is judge of things that concern me. But we know that all men are equal by nature. And this equality implies some sort of epistemic symmetry, Hobbes holds. And from these two premises together with R3, I am judge of things that concern this man. There will be things to unpack about the epistemic symmetry and the equality, which I'll do later in the talk. And once we're at this step, we can posit that things that one judges over count as things that concern them. So this man judging over things that concern me basically gave me a way to judge about those things as well. So I am judge of things that concern me, which of course contradicts the first premise that we started with. So I have like the lightning bolt of contradiction there. So we've reduced the argument, right? And as I said, there are quite a few premises that need more unpacking or need assumptions added. I'm not going to be talking about the last one, about the fact that things that one judges over should count as things that concern them. I think there are grounds in Hobbes to flesh this out, so it probably works, but it's also a bit dubious. I'm going to be focusing on the first two yellow arrows that I put there. So why is it the case that if I am not the judge of things that concern me, then another man is, right? Why is it? Well, assuming that there must be a judge, why is it another man? Why is there no other standard? And then what does it mean that we are equal and this implies epistemic symmetry? Okay, so starting with the first. Oh, this I already said. I am ahead of my PowerPoint. Right. Oh, sorry. I keep seeing things. Right, private judgment in the state of nature. So the question was, why are the means to my self-preservation a matter of private judgment, whether judgment is mine or some other man's, right? And there are two interrelated reasons. They are fairly well known. The first is, and the stronger one, is that Hobbes doesn't think there is a self-obvious natural intersubjective standard, right? And this is because he doesn't think, as we will discuss in a second, that there is a faculty of right reason. There is a further discussion of whether he thinks that there is no natural intersubjective standard, period. He might think that. But in any case, even if there is such a standard, you do not have direct epistemic access to it. It is not self-obvious. It's not self-applying. So you will need some faculty to capture it. And he thinks you don't have that, and we'll see in a moment. And then the second more obvious reason is that you could have a non-private judgment of the type that a sovereign is going to offer, an artificial intersubjective standard, but we posited that we are in the state of nature, so you cannot have that either. And I should note here that when I talk about private judgment, there is no strong normative component to this word that you might assume today. We understand simply by this the last opinion in a mental discourse. So it might well be that you are wrong, right? If you weren't wrong, it wouldn't be an opinion. Right. So I said that Hobbes thinks there is no self-obvious intersubjective standard because he rejects the idea of there being a faculty of right reason. This is actually fairly consistent in all three of his important political works. This is a footnote from the Kiwe, which is sometimes said to put more emphasis on right reason, but we will see that this is deceiving. Where he explains what he means by right reason as the faculty that will give you the laws of nature, right? And he says, by right reason in the natural state of man, I understand not as many do an infallible faculty. We know from Elements of Law that he thinks this is not found or known in nature. But the act of reasoning, that is the peculiar and true raciocination of every man concerning those actions of his which either redound to the damage or benefit of his neighbors. I was a bit lazy here, so this is the Charles Cotton translation, the 17th century one. But the word for peculiar in the Latin is propria, so it's man's own reason, right? And he explains what he means by this. If you don't have civil government, every man's own reason is to be accounted not only the rule of his own actions, but also the measure of another man's reason, and there is no other standard, right? So this is what he means by right reason, and it might be worth just disambiguating how Hobbes uses the word reason, right? He uses it often to refer to an art of reckoning, of calculating, which is basically manipulating words according to the rules of syllogism. And this art, as concerns the epistemic standing, will be certain, but it will be very dependent on the quality of its inputs, right? So if the words you have are not properly inducted from particulars, someone is not muted. Oh. Okay. If the words are not properly inducted or not well defined, then the results you get are not going to be good. But the rules themselves are certain, right? He also uses reason to refer to the ability to use this art of manipulating words. So it's a faculty, but in a thin sense, it's not the right reason of Aquinas. And it is a commonplace that he emphasizes it more in the earlier works than in Leviathan. Although even in Leviathan, I think he granted that it is a very thin faculty. You have this ability naturally because you have the ability to use words. And this ability is in principle reliable, but it is not infallible, right? And then the sense that will be very important to us is the individual application of this art. This is every man's own reason, right? So you have this set of rules, but you're applying them, and you have a fair chance of getting it wrong, both because you might make just mental errors in applying the rules, and also because of the problem we already discussed of having bad inputs, having words that are not defined properly, or what have you, right? And so it is typical of Hobbes to emphasize the distance between reason in general as like a true ratiocination and the individual application of reason, every man's own reason, and to say that there is no standard to which you can get at reason in general. And you might think that this applies just to evaluative language, to what's good and bad in the state of nature, because there you can see very clearly how people might form different conceptions under the word good and bad. But it actually applies to all things that can be reasoned about. And this is a very nice passage from the Leviathan about controversies in arithmetic, something Hobbes knew things about, right? So I'm going to read parts of it out loud, right? So in arithmetic, unpracticed men must, and professors themselves may often err and cast up false. So they might be mistaken in their calculations. Not but that reason itself is always right reason. It is, as well as arithmetic is a certain infallible art. but that no one man's reason, nor the reason of any one number of men makes the certainty. No more than an account is therefore well cast up, because a great many men have unanimously approved it. Right. So here we have the distinction I was talking about between reason as a set of infallible rules, and the individual people's reason, which cannot, which might not accord with right reason. And this is just granting that everyone has their private judgment. And what will happen in this case will be a conflict, right? And therefore, as when there is a controversy in an account, the parties must by their own accord set up for right reason the reason of some arbitrator or judge, to whose sentence they will both stand, or their controversy must either come to blows or be undecided for want of a right reason constituted by nature. So it is also in all debates of all kinds whatsoever, whatsoever. So this is a very general phenomenon. And we kind of saw how granting private judgment to all people in all things, as long as there is no intersubjective standard, can lead you to conflict. However, in this passage, we also have a way out of conflict, and I'm going to claim that equality is the hinge here, right? We are told that that when there is a controversy, you must set up an arbitrator or judge. And I'm going to look into what it takes to choose an arbitrator. And stay tuned for the second part of this passage to continue, which is actually quite fun. Okay, choosing an arbitrator. So you have two steps to choose an arbitrator. The first is going to be that you have to acknowledge epistemic symmetry between you and the people you're debating with, right? And the second is that somehow you have to get out of this epistemic equality and set up an epistemic authority. I'm going to be focusing a lot more on the first step today, just because I don't have a lot of time, and the second step is technically taking you out of the state of nature, but I will have something to say about that at the end as well. Right, so let's look at what it takes to acknowledge epistemic symmetry. This is finally the thing we have seen in the first reductive argument, right? Where Hobbes seemed to say, well, I can't by reason grant myself a standing to judge, which I don't also grant to others. And that is because once I accept once I accept natural equality, I sort of accept that other people have like the same right to judge as I do. And so the question here is going to be, why do I accept this equality? How does it play with reason, right? So why is it the case that I can't reason in a way that excludes other people's ability to reason? And given the way I set up this talk, right, on my first slide, it said that in the state of nature, people are by nature equal. You might think that equality is a natural fact that we must take into consideration. It would be a little tricky, just because there are many passages in Hobbes where he seems to acknowledge that there are differences between people, and more particularly differences between people in mental capacities, especially reason. So that would be a first stumbling block. But regardless of this, he also says explicitly that we must acknowledge equality, whether it is verified by experience or not, for reasons of preserving the peace. And I'm going to discuss this in a minute. So I think that equality as a natural fact that we might take into consideration is a partial explanation of what's going on, but probably not a sufficient one. And instead, I'm going to look at the continuation of the fragment about the mathematicians fighting, where Hobbes gives an interesting analogy with a game of cards. It's like a trick-taking game. So everyone gets a hand, and a dealer turns a trump. So the dealer turns a card that belongs to a particular suit, and then you have to lay down, cards that go according to that suit, right? And he's going to use this analogy to show what happens in controversies, right? So when men think themselves wiser than all others, clamor and demand right reason for judge, ye seek no more, but that things should be determined by no other men's reasons but their own. It is as intolerable in the society of men as it is in play after trump is turned, to use for trump on every occasion that suit whereof they have most in their hand. For they do nothing else that will have every of their passions as they come to bear sway in them to be taken for right reason, and that in their own controversies, bewraying their want of right reason by the claim they lay to it. Right. So what happens in this scenario is that the person who tries to play this game by changing the rules according to what they have in their hand, so by declaring Trump whatever suit of cards they happen to have in their hand, is intolerable to the society of men. So the game collapses, and this seems to betray a fundamental misunderstanding of the rules on their part, right? They claim they have an authority over the rules, which they do not, and the fact that they don't grasp this shows that they do not get the rules at all. And this image appears in Hobbes also in his debate with Bishop Bramhall, where similarly he flags the fact that neither he nor Bramhall have the right reason, right? Neither mine nor the bishop's reason is right reason fit to be a rule of our moral actions. And instead, the law is the only thing we have for right reason, in the same manner as men in playing up turn up Trump, and as in playing their game, their morality consisted in not renouncing, so not switching to the suit you have in your hand. So in our civil conversation, our morality is all contained in not disobeying the laws. So it seems to be the same kind of procedural image. All that there is to this game of reason is that once you've accepted the initial rules, you have to submit, and you cannot put yourself above them, right? There are, however, two ways of cashing this out, and I am almost out of time, so I will discuss what I can of this now, and we can discuss this more in Q&A. So I said we could think that equality is a natural fact that must enter into consideration, but this doesn't capture the ways in which Hobbes seems to acknowledge some natural inequalities and the emphasis he puts on equality accepted as a value. And given what we saw in the current passage, there are maybe two ways of cashing out the relationship between equality and reason. So one of them is a reading that Kinch Hoekstra gave in a very nice 2013 paper about equality in Hobbes. And that is basically going back to this idea of not playing by the rules being intolerable in the society of men. So because all people claim a standing as epistemic equals. So Hobbes says at some point, nobody is foolish enough to think that they cannot govern themselves. You will have to, in order to avoid conflict, you will have to grant equality to people, whether they have it or not. Right. So the foolish people are clearly not your equal, but there is nothing gained for you from not acknowledging them as equal. And given the fact that nothing is gained from you, you would equally be a fool to not do that. So it is a sort of self-defeating argument. And this is actually plays quite well with the fact that Hobbes puts equality among the laws of nature, which, as I said in the beginning, are theorems of reason. So in the Leviathan, I think it would be like the ninth law of nature, the one against pride, where you have to acknowledge all people as equals, and then a bunch of them afterwards that flesh out what this would mean. So if that is the case, it is not at least not wholly a natural fact that people are equal. It is partly that you admit this for the sake of preserving peace. Although I will also flag that in that passage, in the law of nature passage, Hobbes says that to not acknowledge equality, it goes both against reason and against experience. So he might be somewhere in the middle. Another way to maybe think of this, which might be too formal for Hobbes, I admit, is to think that there is something about the exercise of reason itself that mandates equality. So once you have this set, because reason for him is externalized, and it is an art of using words and using them in community, there is something intrinsically social about it, which makes it the case that it is very hard to use reason in a competent way, so not get discarded as yourself as a competent user of reason, while denying that standing to others. Because again, there is nothing in reason that tells you you have the right reason. Right, you have to acknowledge that there is a stop here to the regress. You don't have a meta access to your conclusions to say, I'm sure of this. This is the right thing, right? So these are three ways of cashing out the relationship between equality and reason. I think probably the second one is the most Hobbesian one, but I think there are elements of all three in Hobbes. And now, just briefly, I'm going to talk about what it is to choose an arbitrator once you have acknowledged epistemic symmetry, right? So the nice twist on this is that once you've acknowledged this epistemic symmetry, you can you acknowledge that almost any man's reason is as good as your own, or at least you do not have the tools to say that it is bad if they claim it is good. You don't have the standing if they do not, accept your reasoning, right? And once you have that, you realize that there is no argument within the sphere of epistemic reasons for making someone the authority, and the authority can only be a political authority. So I'm going to close with this passage from the dialogue on the common laws of England, which picks up again the trick playing card game image, but now with a twist. So the discussion here is who is going to determine punishment in the case of crimes that have never been seen before, so don't have a precedent in common law. And the student lawyer says, well, the judge will determine it according to reason. And the philosopher replies in the most Hobbesian manner imaginable, according to whose reason? Right? And he claims, well, it cannot be the natural reason of this or that judge, because that reason is going to be diverse. Everyone is going to have their own reason, so you're not going to be able to have like one standard, which worries the lawyer, who says, well, if the natural reason neither of the king nor of anyone else be able to prescribe a punishment, how can there be any lawful punishment at all? And this is the twist that I think is nice, where Hobbes is going to derive this authority based on acknowledging epistemic symmetry, right? For I think that this is the yellow passage. For I think that in this very difference between the rational faculties of particular men lies the true and perfect reason that makes every punishment certain. For but give the authority of defining punishments to any man whatsoever, and let that man define them, and right reason has defined them. The fact that there is no standard and everyone is equal means that, well, whichever one of us could do it, right? And suppose that definition be both made and made known before the offense committed. For such authority is to trump in card playing, save that in matter of government, when nothing else is turned up, clubs are trump, right? So the the end thing on which this authority rests is not epistemic in nature. It is political power. It is actual physical clubs, right? So in this sense, clubs are Trump. And I'm sorry to end on this bad word, but yes, this is my presentation.
Thank you. Let's move without further ado to the second paper. So next in line is Dan Garber. And the title of the paper, I have to switch here the screens to get to the title of your paper.
No, I thought we were going to do the Spinoza paper second.
We are going to do the Spinoza paper second. Okay, then our next speaker is Salvatore Caranante from the University of Pisa on the divine law, facets of law in Spinoza's TTP, chapter 4.
Okay, thank you very much for this opportunity. I thought I was the third one, so I have not prepared yet my PDF. Okay. Okay. Can you read the PDF?
Yes. Yes, we can.
Okay. Okay. So, thank you again. My paper mainly focuses on the fourth chapter of Tractatus Theologico-Politicus. And this chapter is a very important, a crucial chapter in the Tractatus Theologico-Politicus, insofar as it's strictly connected to one of the main reasons behind the composition of Tractatus. Reasons that are exposed by Spinoza in the letter to Oldenburg of autumn 1665. More precisely, the idea to remove the prejudice about the primacy of a revealed knowledge over the natural knowledge. So, my paper aims at three purposes. Firstly, to explore the manifold definition of law, as we can read from the definition of law that we can read in this chapter. Secondly, the strict connection between the pages of this fourth chapter of TTP and the metaphysics of Etica Amore Geometrico Demonstrata. And thirdly, how Spinoza's reflection about law is deeply influenced by what we may call Spinoza's Averroism. So, as you can see, I have made here a divisio textus of this chapter in order to show you the structure of Spinoza's argumentation. And you can see that he starts with a definition of law. And this is a very Spinozian way of argumentating, starting with the definition and then introducing some specification starting from a definition. The word law, in an absolute sense, signifies that in accordance with which each individual thing, or all things of the same kind, behave in one and the same fixed and determined way, depending upon either natural necessity or a human decision. So you can see that the law here is Spinoza introduces a first distinction between two forms of law. There is a law that depends upon natural necessity and a law that depends upon human decision. This distinction is very important in order to understand the prosecution of Spinoza's argumentation. And you can see here that this definition is deeply rooted in Spinoza's metaphysical and physical reflection. Here I have reported a text from Tractatus about the emendation of intellect, where the law is defined as the true code according to which all singular things come to be and are ordered. But more important in the Tractatus Theologico-Politicus is the law that depends upon a human decision. The law, as Spinoza writes in Latin, ab hominum placito. The law ab hominum placito is the law by means of which men give up their right which they receive from nature in order to achieve a better and safer life or for other reasons. So the law that depends upon human decision is identified with what we can call in Latin jus, the civil law. Say we can say that the law that depends upon human decision is the civil law, the jus. And by means of this law, men give up their right which they receive from nature. So by means of the civil law, men give up part of the law that they have received from nature. What is this? What is this right that men receive from nature? Well, to understand to this question, we have to read further the Tractatus and go to chapter 16, where the right, the natural right, is defined as the right under which all human beings are born and for the most part live. A right that prohibits nothing but what no one desires or no one can do. And when human beings give up this natural right, they become citizens. They decide to enter in the city governed by the civil law, by the jus. And the origin of the civilization is connected by means of the introduction of the decrees of the jus, is connected to the necessity to defend themselves. When humans build societies, they are more capable of defend themselves from threats, from aggressions from outside and so on. And I have here, you can see this is a very common definition of use and about the origin of society. You can see here, for example, at point B, a passage from the discourses on Livy of Machiavelli, where you can see that men, and the last line, men are restrained to inhabit together a place elected by them, more advantageous to live in and easier to defend, in order to better defend, to live securely, and to live in a more satisfying way. So this is the first distinction between the law, the physical law, and the civil law. But in which sense we can really talk about law that depend upon human decision? Well, it's not easy to understand in which sense there can be something that depends completely upon human decision in a cosmos like the reality that Spinoza describes, deeply influenced by the necessity that depends upon the natural causation. Insofar or everything is regulated by necessary causes, in which sense we can talk about laws that depends upon human decision? Well, Spinoza offers only a partial response to this question. Firstly, Spinoza, you can see here from the point 1-2. Firstly, Spinoza writes that insofar as man is a part of nature, is also a part of nature's power. Hence, whatever follows from the necessity of human nature results also, albeit necessarily, from the capacity of man. Secondly, and we are here. Secondly, I have said that these laws depend upon human decisions because we ought to define and explain things by their proximate causes. And the general consideration of necessity and the connectedness of causes cannot help us at all in the formation and ordering of particular things. So, from a strictly philosophical point of view, everything is deeply influenced by the natural causation. So we cannot say that something depends entirely from upon human decision. But for the purposes of the Tractatus Theologico-Politicus, Spinoza deals with the laws as contingent realities, and here I have here you can read two passages from Ethica, where you can read firstly that firstly you can read that man in nature cannot be analyzed as a dominion within the dominion. So the laws established by a human being cannot be read apart from the general background of natural causation. But in the specific case of Tractatus Theologico-Politicus, Spinoza chooses to deal with human with the civil laws as contingent or possible realities. And in Spinoza's from Spinoza's point of view, contingent or possible realities are those realities whose causal series cannot be completely reconstructed, cannot be completely described. After having analyzed the law from an absolute point of view, Spinoza goes on with his analysis and starts with the analysis of the analysis of the law commonly meant, the law as is understood in the common language. Well, and Spinoza starts with a paradox. In fact, he says that it seems to be only by a metaphor that the word law is applied to natural things. What is commonly meant by a law is a command which man may or may not follow, since a law constrains human powers within certain limits which they naturally exceed and does not command anything beyond their scope. Law, therefore, seems to have to be defined more precisely as a rule for living which a man prescribes to himself or others for some purpose. So you can see that Spinoza makes a distinction between 2 points of view. On the one hand, we have the point of view of the philosopher. And for the philosopher, law is, first of all, the natural law. The law as a law of nature, as a physical law. For the common man, in the common language, law is the physical law only at a second level. In the common language, law is first defined as firstly identified with the civil law, with the law that men give to themselves in order to live in a social context. Secondly, Spinoza writes that the real purpose of law is normally evident only to a few. Most people are more or less incapable of grasping it and hardly live by reason at all. Hence, legislators have wisely contrived another purpose very different from the one which necessarily falls from the nature of laws. They promise to those who keep the laws things that the common people must desire, and threaten those who violate them with with what they most fear. So fear and desire are the realities, the affections that the majority of people connect to the law. But the legislators are aware of the real purpose of the laws. And the real purpose of the laws are to ensure a satisfying and sure life for the majority of people. So you can see that here Spinoza introduces another distinction of a point of view. From at the first level, there is the law as it is perceived from the majority of people. And the majority of people obeys to the law only because they have fear of the punishment or because they desire a reward. But from the legislator's point of view, the law have been established only in order to keep, unite, and sure the society. After having, so you can see also that the common definition of law is a canonical definition. You can find also in Justinianus the idea that the law is completely based upon the civil law is based upon the distribution of rewards and punishments according to the actions of the individual. Shortly below these lines, Spinoza introduces the distinction between human law and divine law. By human law, writes Spinoza, I mean a rule for a living whose only purpose is to protect life and preserve the country. By divine law, I mean the law which looks only to the supreme good, that is, to the true knowledge and the love of God. So, on the one hand, we have the human law, whose purpose is to protect life and to keep the society together. On the other hand, we have the divine law, whose purpose is the supreme good. How has to be understood this supreme good in Spinoza's perspective? Well, this supreme good is identified with the perfection of human being. And the highest good, writes Spinoza, and this highest good and perfection depends on a knowledge of God alone. Man is necessarily most perfect and most participates in the highest happiness, who most loves and most enjoys, above all other things, the intellectual knowledge of God, who is the most perfect being. So the highest good from a philosophical perspective has to be identified with the perfection of human being, and this perfection is achieved insofar as human being achieves a perfect knowledge of God. And here Spinoza is clearly making reference to the doctrine of amor Dei intellectualis, as it is exposed in the fifth part of Ethica Amore Geometrico Demonstrata. But this highest good, this perfect knowledge of God that represents the highest good for the human being, cannot be achieved by all human beings in Spinoza's perspective. The amor Dei intellectualis can be achieved only by the few men that are capable of achieving the third kind of knowledge, the intuitive knowledge. For the other men, the highest good is to be identified only with a secure life, with the life based upon a material satisfaction. And it's for this reason that the divine law from a philosophical point of view cannot be identified with what the majority of men understand as the divine law, namely the Mosaic law. In this sense, you can see that Spinoza constantly distinguishes the point of view of the philosopher from the point of view of the majority of human beings. For the philosopher, the divine law is the law that allows men to achieve the highest good, and the highest good is the perfection, is the third kind of knowledge, is the amor dei intellectualis. But for the majority of men, the divine law has to be identified with the law of Moses, with the Mosaic law. You can see also how in this fourth chapter of Tractatus is connected to one of the main purposes of the Tractatus, namely the destruction of the prejudice of the theologians. In fact, Spinoza wants to replace the theological idea of divine law with a new idea of divine law. The divine law as can be grasped from a philosophical point of view. In Spinoza's perspective, the divine law, in a proper sense, cannot be identified with the Mosaic law. This is the core. This is the core point of Spinoza's perspective. More specifically, Spinoza introduces four conditions that has to be satisfied by the divine law. The divine law, you can see here from this point, the divine law is universal or common to all men, and the Mosaic law is not common to all men. The Mosaic law, in Spinoza's perspective, was only directed to the Hebrews and to the Jews, and was intended to keep safe and united the state, the Mosaic state, the state of the Jews. Secondly, the divine law does not require belief in any kind of historical narrative. Thirdly, the natural divine law does not require ceremonies insofar it is rooted only in the human reason. And finally, the supreme reward of the divine law is to know the law itself. That is, to know God and to love Him in true liberty with all and constant minds. Whereas the supreme reward in the Mosaic law, and more in general in the civil law, is to be connected to rewards, to material rewards. So, in Spinoza's perspective, the Mosaic law, namely the divine law as was understood by the theologians, does not satisfy these four conditions. It's very interesting, and I'm going to conclude. It's very interesting that these four conditions, even if are not satisfied by Mosaic law, are satisfied by the evangelic law. This is a very peculiar aspect of Spinoza's position. The law as a Moses, as it was understood and transmitted by Moses to the Jews, does not satisfy these conditions. But if we see the new law as was transmitted in the New Testament, well, Spinoza says that the evangelic law, the Christian law, is closer to what Spinoza calls the natural divine law. And this, for for what we can call an epistemological reason. In fact, Moses, you can see from this point, if Moses grasped through revelation or from principles revealed to him, but the knowledge of Moses was based upon the imagination, Christ was able to know the decrees of God directly by means of the third kind of knowledge. And since the knowledge of God achieved by Christ was perfect, was the intuitive knowledge, his message was closer to the natural divine law. To sum up, the Christian law, the divine law as was revealed by Christ, is closer to the natural divine law, is closer to the philosophical point of view, because Christ has achieved a perfect knowledge of God. Finally, which is the real difference that from Spinoza's point of view still distinguishes the Christian law from the divine law as is understood by the philosopher? Well, Spinoza is very clear, states clearly that in the Holy Scriptures we cannot find demonstrations. In the Holy Scripture we cannot, even if the Bible, and here at the end of this passage, even if the Bible fully endorses the natural light of reason and the natural divine law, namely the Bible has nothing that is in contradiction with what we can grasp by means of the natural reason. The Holy Scripture, even if in some points, like the Gospels or the books of Solomon and so on, has a message that is not so far from the natural divine law, well, the Holy Scripture never gives demonstration of this law, and only the philosopher can give demonstration and argumentation in order to show the rational fundaments of the divine law. So we can see that between the scriptures, the Holy Scriptures, the Bible, and the philosophical point of view, there is no contradiction, but at the same time they have they address to different publics, they have different purposes, and they are clearly distinguished from the point of view of the audience to which they are addressed. So thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Salvatore. Let's move now to our third speaker today. Before that, let me remind you that we are waiting for your questions, both of you who are here with us on Zoom and of those who are now listening and watching us on YouTube. So do write your questions. If you are on YouTube, write your questions in the chat. If you are here with us on Zoom, signal the fact that you have questions in the chat so that I know how to moderate, because we will be probably having a time problem at some point. And then Garber is next, and the title of his talk you already see on the slide: Human Nature and Civil Society, Hobbes versus Spinoza. Then you have the floor. Fantastic cartoon.
Great. Thank you very, very much. I'm just trying to figure out how to do this. Can you see the slides?
Yeah, we do.
Great. So then I'll just begin. I'm going to talk about Hobbes and Spinoza on human nature. Spinoza's political philosophy owes a great deal to his contemporary Thomas Hobbes. For Spinoza, as for Hobbes before him, the Commonwealth is the result of individuals who come together to create structures that enable them to live together in relative peace and enable them to prosper individually and collectively. And for Spinoza, as for Hobbes, the character of this Commonwealth is a consequence of certain conception of human nature, the urge people have to persist in being and advance their own interests. It is this endeavor for self-preservation that makes life so unbearable outside of society in a state of nature, and which induces us to come together and form a civil society. However, I'm going to argue that there's a crucial difference in the foundations. For both Hobbes and Spinoza, political philosophy is grounded in a conception of human nature that itself is ultimately grounded in human biology and psychology, and ultimately in the laws of physics. We are the way we are because of our physical and, for Spinoza, psychological makeup. But for Hobbes, human nature is a stable and unchanging grounding for politics. Take away society, and we return to being the same creatures we were before entering into society. However, for Spinoza, it's different, I'm going to claim. For Spinoza, we're genuinely changed in fundamental ways by our participating in society. In what follows, I'm going to outline the main argument. Because of the limitations of time, I'm going to have to give the argument in very broad brushstrokes, but perhaps we can fill out some of the details in discussion. So let me begin with Hobbes. Hobbes' central project in the 1640s and 1650s was what he called the Elements of Philosophy, the Elementa Philosophiae. Though published out of order, it had 3 parts. There we go. At the foundations was the De Corpora, published in 1655, followed by the De Homina, published in 1658. The first, the De Corpora, of course, deals with body and physics. The second deals with a body of particular interest, that's to say the human being. The final book in the series is the one that he published first, the De Cive, first edition 1642, with an important second edition 1647. And that, of course, concerns the citizen and the commonwealth of which the citizen is a part. The order here is very important to Hobbes, not the order of publication, but the sort of philosophical order. The knowledge of the proper organization of the commonwealth depends upon the knowledge of the makeup of human beings. And I quote here from the De Corpora, for the knowledge of the properties of a commonwealth, it is necessary first to know the dispositions, affections, and manners of men. But Hobbes argues the knowledge of human beings depends upon the knowledge of physics. And this is from the De Corpora. After physics, we must come to moral philosophy meaning here the De Homina project, in which we are to consider the motions of the mind, namely appetite, aversion, love, benevolence, hope, fear, anger, emulation, envy, etc., what causes they have and of what they may be causes. The reason why these are to be considered after physics is that they have their causes in sense and imagination, which are the subject of physical contemplation. Since, as Hobbes argues, everything in the world is body, everything that goes on in the human body, including appetite, aversion, etc., must be explicable only in terms of the motion of the smaller parts that make us up. And in this way, physics must ground the science of man. The De Corpora must ground the De Homina. And in turn, the state itself is a complex body made up out of complex human bodies. Thus, the De Cive must follow the De Homina. Now, because of the kinds of creatures that we are, when thrown together in what he calls the state of nature, it is determined that we will behave in a certain characteristic way. Because we all desire to preserve ourselves against aggression and seek our own advantage, humans in a state of nature find themselves in a state of perpetual conflict. Quote, hereby, it is manifest that during the time men live without a common power to keep them all in awe, they are in that condition which is called war, and such a war as is of every man against every man. Leviathan 13, of course. But life in such a condition is clearly unpleasant, solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. Because of that, there are also passions, quote, passions that incline men to peace, in particular, fear of death, desire of such things as are necessary to commodious living, and a hope by their industry to attain them. Reason as well counsels that we seek peace and follow it. But Hobbes argues, the laws of nature, that's to say the dictates of reason, of themselves, without the terror of some power to cause them to be observed, are contrary to our natural passions that carry us to plurality, pride, revenge, and the like. And covenants without the sword are but words and have no strength to secure a man at all. Therefore, notwithstanding the laws of nature, if there be no power erected or not great enough for our security, every man will and may lawfully rely on his own strength and art for caution against all other men. Now, to erect such a power to create laws and enforce them through the fear of punishment, through a mutual covenant, is to create a commonwealth. Though reason and the calmer passions move us to want to live in peace with one another, our fiercer passions oppose that. In order to live in peace, we must transfer our rights to a sovereign, a power capable of keeping our baser passions in check through the fear of punishment. Behind this conception of politics lies a static and unchanging conception of human nature. No doubt there are many ways in which we are altered by our association with other people. One important way in which society can change us, and does, is through education, for example. But however education may change us, there is one way in which human nature remains constant. Hobbes writes, the miserable condition of war is necessarily consequent to the natural passions of men, when there is no visible power to keep them in awe, and tie them by fear of punishment to the performance of their covenants and observation of those laws of nature. From Leviathan chapter 17. Reason is simply not strong enough to keep the baser passions in check. And however much we may want to live in peace with one another, if there is no force to coerce us to follow reason, we won't. And we will necessarily slip back into a state of war of all against all. Why should this be so? For Hobbes, human nature is ultimately grounded in the human body, its makeup, and the deterministic order of nature that ultimately fixes our behavior. Insofar as society cannot change our bodily makeup, it cannot change the passions and inclinations that it gives rise to. Passions and inclinations that ultimately give rise to conflict of all against all when we are in a state of nature. For Hobbes, human nature is a constant, the same inside society and out. Remove the external constraints that the institutions of coercion provide to guarantee that people behave well toward one another, and we're back in a state of war of all against all. That's a bit of a simplification, but we can talk about this during discussion afterwards. Now I would like to turn to Spinoza. There's a thin sense of the notion of human nature in which one can say human nature is unchanging and constant for Spinoza as much as it is for Hobbes. In its most basic sense, human nature is just the tendency that we all have for self-preservation and for seeking our own advantage. But this hardly counts as human nature. The conatus for self-preservation is something that we share with everything, as Spinoza proves in the Ethics. This, of course, is Ethics 3, Proposition 6. But there are thicker senses of human nature at work in Spinoza. In a famous, though not unproblematic passage in the preface to Ethics 4, Spinoza writes, "For because we desire to form an idea of man as a model of human nature, which we may look to, it will be useful to us to retain these same words with the meaning I've indicated." And there he's talking about good and bad, perfect and imperfect. In what follows, therefore, I shall understand by good what we know certainly is a means by which we may approach nearer and nearer to the model of human nature that we set before ourselves. By evil, what we certainly know prevents us from being like that model. Next, we shall say that men are more perfect or imperfect insofar as they approach more or less near that model. Understood in this way, there is a sense of human nature which we don't possess, but which we seek to possess. While each of us may have our own imperfect nature, we all strive for a common nature. While there are debates in the literature, it's plausible to identify that nature with what we would be like if we were to become completely rational. To strive for that nature is to strive to become more and more rational. Spinoza's account of the formation of the state owes an evident debt to Hobbes. Spinoza, like Hobbes, emphasizes the need for the state to protect us from one another. It's for this reason that he suggests we must enter into a contract to institute the civil state in a solid and lasting way. Elsewhere, though, he emphasizes not mutual protection from one another, but the advantages of cooperation as the ground of civil society. This, for example, in Tractatus Theologico-Politicus, chapter 5, where he talks about mutual aid in doing the things that we need to advance our lives. But there's yet another benefit of joining together into a civil society. Quote, "the perfection of human nature and its blessedness." Reason tells us that reason and understanding are the true goods that we should seek. This is one of the important reasons why we seek social organization. By doing so, we create a space in which it's possible for us to have the leisure we need to become more and more rational. And to ensure that our social order is stable, we need to make others understand what we understand, that social order confers on us all these great benefits, and that it is in their interest as well to participate in society and behave well toward others. And so Ethics 4, Proposition 37 reads, "The good which everyone who seeks virtue wants for himself, he also desires for other men, and this desire is greater as his knowledge of God is greater." That is, to the extent that he's more and more rational. The demonstration of that begins as follows. "Insofar as men live according to the guidance of reason, they are most useful to men. Hence, according to the guidance of reason, we necessarily strive to bring it about that men live according to the guidance of reason. Insofar as others are rational, they're more useful to me because they recognize that I am more useful to them as well. In this way, in the well-functioning state, a little rationality in the beginning will beget more and more rationality as time goes by, as the citizens increasingly realize that it's to everyone's advantage to cooperate with one another and to help one another become more and more rational. That's to say, in the well-functioning state, we should all grow closer and closer to the ideal of human nature that we set for ourselves, with one another's help. There's also, by the way, a story for people who do have limited capabilities for reason. They're altered through the institutions of religion and obedience to scripture, but there isn't enough time to discuss that here. And in this way, society changes us. human nature is altered by participating in society. In this way, civil society has a kind of historical dimension for Spinoza. Peoples change and grow by virtue of their continued association with one another in both civil and religious institutions. We're different people by virtue of participating in society. Our nature evolves. Now, should that civil society dissolve, we can expect that the changes in reason and religion that have come as a result of participating in society and its institutions will remain. There's no reason why the lack of civil institutions should make anyone less rational than before. Even without government, rational people would continue to be rational and would continue to behave well toward one another. At the limit, when everyone is rational, government isn't needed at all. This is a marvelous passage from the TTP. Now, if men were so constituted by nature that they desired nothing except what true reason teaches them to desire, then of course, society would require no laws, but it would be completely sufficient to teach men true moral lessons so that they would do voluntarily, wholeheartedly, and in a manner worthy of a free man what is really useful. So if we were completely rational, then the coercive institutions of the state could wither away and people would continue to behave rationally. In this way, one might say that Spinoza's political theory terminates not in democracy, but in anarchy, the lack of government altogether. However, as Spinoza fully realized, this is an impossible dream. Even so, lacking the constraints of a civil society, we could still expect more rational people to behave well toward one another. For Hobbes, when the state dissolves, we return straight away to a war of all against all. But for Spinoza, our nature can change through socialization. We are not the same people we were before entering into society. Why is that so for Spinoza, but not for Hobbes? Well, let me develop here an idea that was originally suggested to me by Oded Schechter and Yitzhak Melamed. One of the key ideas in Spinoza's thought is that as we become more and more rational, we lose our fear of death. A free man, arguably the person who has attained this higher level of, who meets this standard of the nature of man that we talked about earlier. A free man thinks of nothing less than of death, and his wisdom is a meditation on life, not on death. One might argue, and I think Spinoza does, to the extent that we are rational, that is, when we are guided by reason, we are not guided by the fear of death or fear of anything else, but by a recognition that it is to our advantage to love our neighbor and enter into a cooperative relation with him or her. But insofar as one remains rational, even without society, one remains less afraid of death. But not so for Hobbes. Education can change us in many ways, to be sure, and it can make us be better citizens, more cooperative and malleable by the sovereign. But however it changes us, the fear of death is built in, hardwired, and not so easy to eliminate. This fear is present in society and is, at least in part, why we persist in obeying the sovereign and keeping our place. And when society crumbles, it is why we revert to the state of nature, to the war of all against all. For Hobbes, our biology is in a way our destiny. For Spinoza, our history marks us in a permanent way. Hobbes died, but Spinoza merged into eternity. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dan. Well, time for questions. We already have a question from Bill Eaton. Bill, would you like to pose the question yourself?
Yeah, sure. It's primarily for Claudia, but thanks for this wonderful panel. I'm just fascinated by this idea of, and I think it's because I'm just such a Cartesian that reason has this the social nature, and I find that really fascinating. So my question might just be the result of this kind of Cartesian assumption, but I'll just read it. So if I can't trust myself to be the standard of right reason, and don't have this kind of meta access to the correct standard of right reason, then how can I ever enter into an agreement or overcome a controversy with someone else, since doing so seems to require such trust? And if I can trust my judgment to accept the equality of someone else's reason, say, then why can't I serve as the standard?
Thank you, Bill. Yeah, so, you can't see my, okay, you won't be able to see me on YouTube unless I do this. Right. So this is actually kind of what got me started on the right reason track. I think this is an actual problem for Hobbes, and it is very similar to all kinds of problems of the political beginnings that you can pose, right? If you have all the ingredients to start society, well, you would have started it, and if you don't, then you can't really bootstrap yourself out of it. I think I would say two things. So on the one hand, Hobbes is not he is skeptical to some extent in there being any absolute knowledge, but he does think that human faculties are reliable, right? So he thinks that the main source of errors are opinions of false knowledge, so prejudices, right? So as long as you have a blank slate and you form your conceptions correctly, you can, and then you apply a method, you can, in most cases, get to an okay result. I don't think he has a firm grounding for this, why does he think this given all he has told us, but I don't think he is particularly worried about it. I would say that it's possible to give a more wholly social response, I guess, to say, yeah, there is some kind of rule following paradox here, although Hobbes doesn't see it. But the only thing we can really do is to accept that the kind of authority that's going to be in place is not going to be an epistemic authority once you've reached the limits of discussion. So you might have rational discussion, and it might go on for quite a while, right? So in mathematics, it's not always going to be the case that you get into horrible debates about whether you've squared a circle. For the most part, you will be able to present your reasons, and others will be able to grasp it. But this is always not fully robust. And at the moment when you get into a controversy, how contingent it was is revealed to you, and then you will have to move to just political factors or social factors, right? You will have to trust a person, and that will not be necessarily trusting their rational capacities as much as it would be, I for some reason assume that we're all the same, let's not question where you got this assumption. And so he might as well say it. And I'm not, what I'm going to give to the sovereign is not going to be epistemic assent. The sovereign cannot make you change your beliefs, but it is going to be behaving as if you believe it, right? So this will, I guess, have the most obvious implications in the case of religion. Privately, you might not be convinced by whatever it was told to you, but you have an obligation to shut up and participate in the common life.
I have a follow-up, and also Dan Garber has a follow-up. Let me just put my finger first. It's what is not entirely clear to me is that there is in Hobbes a notion of agreement. why do agree on a demonstration? I mean, it's clear why we don't agree and how controversies are. But I would say that you also need to have some sort of notion of what agreement is for two reasons. One is that if indeed there is an idea of equality, then it's a bit ridiculous that the only way of agreeing is submitting to the other's authority. I mean, that's not conducive to any kind of equality. And the second is, of course, that famous moment of the social contract, which somehow we all agree to put our arms down and, decide that someone should take the power and become the sovereign. So what does Hobbes have to say about this? Is there any notion of agreement there?
Let me go back to. Yes. I think this is so. If you take seriously what he says as a skeptical challenge, I guess there wouldn't be a strong notion of agreement. You could always say, well, how do we know that I agree to this rule? How do I know that you agree to the rule? How do we know that we're like speaking the same?
Infinite regress.
Yeah, it's an infinite regress. But I do not think that he takes this thing seriously, and you can sort of see it in even in conversations about the civil state, where you delegate your judgment to the sovereign. And if you have an infinite regress, you're going to have it there as well. How do you know what the sovereign says? Even if the judge interprets it for you, how are you going to know that that's like, what you're doing? But also you're going to keep some version of self-preservation in mind. So if the sovereign threatens your life, you're not obligated to obey. But that implies that you are able to judge whether your life is threatened, and at least in extreme cases, that judgment is going to like be the reliable one, which I think actually threatens like all the other cases. Because if you have this judgment, what is actually stopping it from ranging free over all cases? What is stopping you from overreacting, for example? And this might again be something that society achieves through education. So you're going to have like the big dilemma of how do you get society, but granted that you get it somehow, right? Maybe someone conquers you and the whole problem becomes moot. Once you get it, there are mechanisms that are going to sort of keep you in check without this necessity of sort of rational regress.
Dan has also a follow-up here.
Yeah, Bill began his comment by remarking on the sort of social nature of reason in Hobbes, and that definitely is there in what it is that you're emphasizing. But there is another. But from time to time, Hobbes does acknowledge that there is really a right and wrong. I'm thinking, for example, in chapter 31, where he's talking about, this is the kingdom of God by nature, about natural punishments. He says, foreseeing punishments are consequent to the breach of laws. Natural punishments must be naturally consequent to the breach of laws of nature. And those are, he means by that, the laws of reason, and therefore follow them as their natural, not arbitrary effects. If you smoke, you're going to get cancer. If you're rude, you're going to get into a fight, so on and so forth. Now, if you define right reason in terms of what, say, the sovereign says is right reason, if the sovereign's view doesn't coincide with what actually happens in nature, you're going to get cancer. You're going to get into bad fights. The function of natural reason, of the laws of nature and of reason, is supposed to be to actually aid you in the world to succeed in your preserving yourself. How in this view of right reason, do you think Hobbes can do that in this sort of social definition of right reason?
Wait, we'll go back to this. Yeah, so I guess I don't. I think there's some equivocation going on in like the natural punishment passage. So I don't think that those those natural punishments are natural in the same sense that the natural law is. They're just like physical consequences of your actions. I don't know if they should even like be described as punishments. And it is true that if there is a sort of systematic distortion in how you perceive them, you're going to die. So at one end, Hobbes needs to be able to say that there is at least an acknowledgement of the ingredients for self-preservation, but there is like a very like wide range from that to what the sovereign could tell you as like a matter of public reason. So it might be that yes, the sovereign cannot tell you to do impossible things physically, and he cannot tell you to do things that conduce directly to your death, right? And that would be a thing that Hobbes hasn't like I guess like really argued for, but that he would hold is an objective thing. But in between that and basically almost any other action, you're going to have the interposition of judgments of what's good and bad. So the sovereign could persecute you a lot. The sovereign could dictate that you do dangerous things, and you're not supposed to be able to say no, this is against my self-preservation. So there's like a pole where you have to see like the most dangerous things immediately, but anything apart from that sort of dissolves. And it's unclear to me how that pole can be there. How can you see that like having a sword to your neck is dangerous, but being
Well, there are absurd, yeah, there are absurd things that the sovereign could say, look, this is right reason and this isn't. And at which point perhaps you could disagree, but the thing is, what do you do with a Donald Trump who tells you false things about a virus, which are not necessarily absurd, but just are empirically false? And the Hobbes tells you need to follow what the sovereign's judgment is about right reason, which seems to me it could not be necessarily conducive to self-preservation, except perhaps it might be conducive to the preservation of the civil society, which may be in the long run what he considers more important.
It beats the state of nature.
Yeah, it beats the state of nature.
Actually, this is a very good example, Dan. Is the virus threat equivalent to a sword to your throat? So that's a good question. Exactly in the terms of Hobbes might say, well, you might be wrong or something.
Yeah, I don't know. I just wanted to put that. Yeah. It's a problem I find with Hobbes, not necessarily with your account.
I mean, no.
Because you were certainly, the account that you gave is certainly something that's.
No, I think that like, so the passage of like natural punishments also makes the point that the chain of consequences is so long that you might not be able to follow it. So in Dana's case, yes, the chain of consequences from the virus to however, percentage of people are going to die from it is like so long that you could be wrong at various points in it. Yeah. And so you'll have to defer to someone.
Yeah.
Right. Let's take another question for Claudia, and then we move to questions for Salvatore and for Dan. So, Ohad. Ohad, can you turn on your mic?
Yeah. Well, I just wrote it down. I was just curious about the term right reason. I mean, and let me add that it sounds a bit as though it's used not so much as most rational, but as just the reason that gets to decide the case. And in that case, I mean, I don't know that the term reason is the best one to be used there at all, but I may, this is just kind of what I'm kind of gathering from the way you present the.
Yeah. Okay. So I have something to say about if about your initial question, which was, is this like a peculiarity of Hobbes? It's definitely like not. He's appropriating the language of right reason that the medievals were using. And the reason they were using it is exactly to short circuit the problem we had. How do you have, how do you follow rules? How do you have access to them? Well, you have this you have the faculty of reason, and it is able to grasp sort of moral truth and go from there. So he's taking that and just changing its meaning, basically. So the footnote from the keyword was doing this explicitly. I don't hold it to be that kind of infallible faculty. I hold it to be a correct process of calculating, right? And according to his definition, this will count as reason, though you might wonder, well, what counts as correct? Right? And this will vary. He wants to say, well, the standard cannot come from the consensus of people, but it is very unclear where the standard comes from, right? He's going to lay down that logic and mathematics are shared by people and seem to work fine. And that is partly because they're not clouded by any private interest, whereas in other areas, you do have private interests, so it's not as clear what you would follow. But I don't think there's a good justification for why you would hold that the standard mathematics is, correct, apart from here it is the method. This is what we follow, and as long as it adheres to that, it's fine.
Right. There is a very specialized long question by Dennis in the chat that Dennis said it's just for Salvatore and it's written. So Salvatore, you have it there. Rafi has a question that is both for Dan and for Salvatore. So Raphael Kurt Landau, can you on the mic?
Rafi, your microphone is not on.
There we go. How about now?
Much better.
Microphone is on. Can you all the others, can you switch off the microphone because there are some mics that are on? Rafi, please.
So my question is primarily for Dan, because it's an objection to what Dan has been trying to sell us here. But I'm really curious what Salvatore wants to say as well. Dan, my objection has to do with innovation, so I thought you would appreciate it.
Okay.
I think that the interpretation you've given of Spinoza says that Spinoza is an innovator. He's trying to reshape human nature. You've said human nature evolves. And I think it's an exciting reading of Spinoza, and I'm sure there's a way of developing it. But for me, there is at least another way of reading Spinoza, which I find illuminating. Spinoza isn't really concerned with changing human nature. For Spinoza, the goal is to recuperate something lost. Human nature is already in the world. Your essence already exists. It's fixed. It's eternal. Right? We haven't yet reached the point of human history where people start commonly saying things like, "Oh, well, everything that was previously taken to be fixed is in fact malleable." No, for Spinoza is much more conservative. He's trying to recuperate something which has been concealed. And the way I read Spinoza, the function of the state is not to reshape human nature, but it's to help us be who we are. It's to help uncover human nature, which is eternal and fixed. Now, there is an area where Spinoza is an innovator, and there's an area where he wants philosophers to innovate, and that's language. And that comes through in Salvatore's talk. So, for example, what philosophers do, I think this is part of what Salvatore was gesturing at, philosophers innovate with language. Philosophers need to talk about philosophical realities, and what they do is they reach around for words that are lying around, and they give these words new meanings. So, for example, the word law has been lying around. Let's use it metaphorically to talk about laws of nature. And I think that in the domain of language, philosophers are not trying to recover some kind of original meaning of words. They're really adding genuinely new meanings. So we have innovation in the sphere of language, but no innovation in the sphere of human nature. We're really just trying to give expression to something that has already existed. It's just one way of reading the Spinoza, but it's a way I find quite powerful. So I wanted to invite you to say a little more in defense of your reading. And I also wanted to invite Salvatore to comment on this way of bringing your two papers together, if you think that's a useful frame.
Great. Let me just say a few words. I won't go on for a long time. Yeah, you're absolutely right. There's a very interesting sense in which what he talks about, for example, in Ethics 4, is the extent to which, well, there is nothing more useful to a human being than another human being, right? There is something, horses are not. Horses are useful to horses, human beings are useful to human beings. And insofar as I have passions and you have different passions, that in a certain sense colors or hides the common human nature that we have. And the point, part of the point of becoming more and more rational is to reveal the human nature that we have in common. It's true. But the fact of the matter is, I think Hobbes, to talk about human nature as such is imposing, I think, a vocabulary on Spinoza that is not really his. And I even think that what he says about human beings and human nature, what we have in common as human beings in Ethics 4, stands in some tension with what he says about universals in Ethics 2, Proposition 40, First Scholium. So there's a bit of a problem there, but but this I think is true. Being in society changes us, whether it brings us closer to the true human nature or whether it creates a new human nature. I admit there are different ways in which you can parse that. On the other hand, it is something very different, I think, from what's going on in Hobbes, where when we leave society, we're back in the state of nature. For example, in the English Civil War, before the revolt, before the Civil War, there was a going Commonwealth. After the Civil War, or during the Civil War, when the Commonwealth had broken down, people, as Hobbes says explicitly in chapter 13 of Leviathan, reverted back to a state of nature. And that's not something that I think happens in Spinoza. Salvatore, would you like to comment?
Yes, if I can add something to this very interesting discussion. I think that we can perhaps solve this question about the purpose of the state. The state can reshape human nature. The state can bring human beings closer to an idea of perfection. Well, I think that from Spinoza's point of view, there are different levels of accomplishment of human nature. My idea is that Spinoza, who is from this point of view can be named a realist, he's very very aware of the fact that there is a majority of human beings that are completely absorbed by their passions. They only understand the fear of a punishment and the promise of a reward. I think that they can be taken closer to a rational idea of life, but they cannot be the same as the philosophers. From this point of view, I think that that Spinoza is an Averroist. Spinoza makes a strong opposition, introduces a strong opposition between the philosopher the philosopher's point of view, the philosopher who can simply thinks that the law is reward for the law itself. And to these few philosophers besides these few philosophers, there is the large majority of people that can only partially redeemed by the legislators, by the state, because this is a matter of fact. From Spinoza's point of view, the majority of people will is carried on by their passions, by their effects, and it will always be so. This is my idea. I think that Spinoza, from a certain point of view, has also a pessimistic view of not of human nature or as such, but of the possibility to accomplish perfectly the human nature. I think that there is that from Spinoza's point of view, there are different levels of accomplishment of human nature, and the perfect accomplishment can be achieved only by philosophers, and the philosophers are not majority. To explain this point more radically, we can say that in a certain sense, for Spinoza, only the philosophers are really human beings. This is an idea that, for example, we can find in the proemium to Averroes commentarium to Aristotle's physics, but also to Aristotle's metaphysics. He is, I think that in a certain way, Spinoza thinks that only philosophers can be seen as complete and perfect human being. I think that in this sense, the legislator, the state, the civil laws can only partially determine the human nature, the nature of the majority of citizens, because the legislator can only influence the human beings on the level of passions, on the level of affects, insofar as their fears, and their hopes are concerned. I think that a legislator cannot persuade the human beings to become rational and to become philosophers, and so to fully accomplish their human nature. This is my idea, and I think that in this idea of this also pessimistic idea of the majority of human beings, plays a role the reading of Machiavelli.
I have a kind of follow up on this debate that you are that Rafi actually started, and let me try to make it simple. I start to see the main differences between Hobbes and Spinoza then as relating to the time scale they seem to have in mind. So, on a short time scale, there's not much of a difference. You can imagine Spinoza's Republic crashing because of the reasons that Salvatore was saying, that there are too few philosophers and the others are going to kill each other in the same way as in Hobbes' State of Nature. The real differences are on the long scale, because Spinoza's citizens seems to be subject to education, while Hobbes, well, although I never understood whether there is a possibility of Hobbes citizens to eventually learn something from the education. I remember Claudia once talking about Hobbes on education. I think that there is a possibility of progressing there too, but maybe at a slower pace. So is there something connected with the time scale they have in mind when they think about politics?
It's an interesting idea. I guess I hadn't thought about it in that way. Here's one difference, though. Hobbes talks a great deal about education. And in fact, one can read the Leviathan as an argument for why it is that the universities need to reform, in particular, adopt as central to the curriculum the Leviathan. It's a book that is, in a certain funny way, an advertisement for itself, because he does think that one of the important things that the sovereign needs to do is educate the citizenry in the importance of following the sovereign, doing what it is that's necessary for maintaining the state. But it's a little different than Spinoza's education in the sense that for Spinoza, the point is to become more and more rational and eventually come to this intellectual love of God. For Hobbes, it's just a narrower political kind of education. Now, as soon as there isn't a state and there isn't a sovereign, all of that education becomes, it seems to me, irrelevant to the behavior of people. As long as there isn't a sovereign to enforce it, all of what it is that you learned in Hobbes's education becomes irrelevant, and you're back in the state of nature. But I'll have to give a little bit of thought about that. There is no more. Hobbes does not recommend a more general cultivation of the intellect in the way in which Spinoza does.
Actually, I think Daria has also a follow-up here.
Yeah, thank you. Yes, as well as these historical examples, because if we have the history of different revolutions, and maybe we can compare between Hobbes and Spinoza, do we really see in the human history something like human being more rational? For example, in 20th century European relationship, can we like make this history to be falsificators or verificators for Spinoza's conception, for example?
I think both of them do use history in interesting ways as illustrations. And actually they both use biblical history. Biblical history in Spinoza in the Tractatus Theologico-Politicus is one of the important examples of that he uses to illustrate some of the things that he says about politics, looking at the ancient Hebrews. You do find a lot of that same discussion as well in Hobbes, but the other big example that Hobbes uses is the English Civil War. It is mentioned. I mentioned that it is found in chapter 13, which is the chapter about the state of nature. When Hobbes is asked, or when Hobbes takes up the question, was there ever, actually a historical state like that in the world? And he says, well, perhaps, in North America and among the natives there, that's the kind of state of nature. But we also find it when the Commonwealth dissolves, people go back into the state of nature, and making a direct reference there to the Civil War. But of course, there's also the book, The Behemoth, which is an interpretation of the Civil War, of the English Civil War, in terms of the politics of the Leviathan. And I think he does take it to help us understand what it is that went wrong, that brought people back to the state of nature in the Civil War.
There are a number of questions in the chat, so let me try. We are kind of approaching the end. Can you please try to be brief? So Jack Sasser with a follow-up.
Thank you, Dana, and nice to see everyone. really exciting discussion. I had a, okay, so I'll try to tie it together. I think this will go back to this point you just made, Daria, about history as an example. You know, I want to support your reading, Dan. That's what I want to do. I think you're kind of helping explain something that often puzzled me in the political treaties, in fact, and that is this idea of a free multitude. That Spinoza would have written the political treaties for a free multitude. And well, how does the multitude become free? Well, you're showing like sort of in a state we develop these rational abilities. I think that's right. I think that, in fact, I think living socially is living rationally, or living rationally is living socially. I mean, they're indissociative. We form a community of natures. That is, we conceive certain ideas under reason, certain common properties of bodies, you know, and that's the community we form. We just are this multitude or this state. Okay, but then there's passages in the TP that would seem to go against your reading, and this is why I think this is what always bothered me in this discussion of free multitude, because it's like, how could we free ourselves from the state we're already in? And he says things like in chapter 6, paragraph 2, that, you know, never will the seditions or discords of a state. Chapter 6, paragraph 2 of the TP. Never will, let me just read that real quickly. Therefore, when disagreements and rebellions are stirred up in a commonwealth, as they often are, the result is never that the citizens dissolve the commonwealth. Very important. The result is never that the citizens dissolve the commonwealth, though this often happens in other kinds of society. I'm not sure what he's talking about there. Instead, if they can't settle their disagreements while preserving the form of the commonwealth, they change its form to another. So it can happen internally, and here's where the historical example might come in to explain why Spinoza wrote the TP at the end of his career. The multitude won't dissolve itself, its state naturally. It won't stop persevering to strive in its existence. But maybe an external force can do that. So I think Spinoza had in mind the collapse of the De Witt regime in 1672. And this may have, in his view, sort of thrown the Dutch, who already were at a very high level of rationality, into a position where maybe they are a free multitude now, and they can start thinking about new ways to form a society. And they'll carry with them, Dan, you see, they'll carry with them the rational skills they'll have acquired in society, and they can start deploying these in different ways. So I think this is a really illuminative reading. I mean, is it conceivable? You know, is it conceivable? This is going back to what you were saying, Salvatore. Is it conceivable that you know, we'll all be rational? Or Dan says, even without government, we continue to be rational. I don't think that's the right way to put it. I don't think we'll be without a government, by the way. But is it conceivable that we'll all be rational? Well, to a varying degrees, right? This is your point. We have there are different levels of sharing human nature in common, right? Like in the very, very, very strict sense, as philosophers, maybe we won't all achieve that level of rationality, but we can still be rational at a sort of 1 degree lower, you know? And this is very confusing because it's not clear when you get from the second and third kind of knowledge in the first place for Spinoza. But basically, just a remark in support of Dan, I thought it was a really interesting discussion of this community of people, these free people. We learn to be free in society. And even if we leave society, we'll still have those skills. And I think Spinoza may have had that in mind when he wrote the political treaties, thinking about, okay, here I am, here are the Dutch, they're very rational. I'm going to give them all these constitutions to think about ways of forming a new society. A rational society. So I really enjoyed that a lot, Dan. Thank you. And I liked the whole panel. There was a really unifying discussion here, but reason as like social reason as sociality. It was very interesting. Okay, thanks a lot.
Can I just a couple of words? This is really complicated. The Tractatus Politicus is I think a move away from some of the earlier views on politics that you get in the Tractatus Theologico Politicus and in Ethics 4. First of all, there is a sense in which you never leave the state of nature in the Tractatus Politicus, but there is equally well a sense in which you are always in a kind of commonwealth. You don't have, it looks like, well, it's a controversial work, but it looks like there's a sense in which you don't really have a compact that you come together with that forms the state. So it's something that arises naturally because of the common interests of people. So the sense of inside society, outside society, in the state of nature, outside the state of nature is, I think, a little bit unclear in the Tractatus Politicus. So what I was saying really is about sort of the earlier works. To take this into account would be sort of an interesting project. But not, it's an interesting project. I'll have to think about that.
Yeah.
But thanks.
Right, let me, with your permission, I will take one more question. But
Can
let
I add
me.
something? Sorry.
Yeah, of course, yes.
I just wanted to answer to Jack.
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, because I find very interesting is unifying remark about the papers. Well, in one passage of 4th chapter of TTP, Spinoza writes that the real purpose of laws is normally evident only to a few. Most people are more or less incapable of grasping it and hardly live by reason at all. This is the starting point of Spinoza. The majority of people hardly live by reason at all. The first level, the first level of rationality that the legislation build by means of the law, by means of the civil law, is to, and I quote from the 3rd chapter of TTP, is to lead men to live securely and satisfyingly. This is we can say that the purpose of the law that are directed from the majority of people is this, to live securely and satisfyingly. And I think that Spinoza thinks that in a certain sense, people can also be free in this context, but they cannot be really just. In fact, in another passage, Spinoza says that who obeys the law only because there is the fear of the punishment and because there is the hope for a reward cannot be really said just. And in this sense, it cannot be neither be said really rational. And in a certain sense, it cannot be said it cannot be said really free. So I think that Spinoza constantly distinguishes a good for the majority and the good properly said for few people. He says he distinguishes the freedom properly said, the freedom of the philosopher, and the freedom that can be achieved by means of the civil law by the majority of people. So I think that the difference of levels is a good starting point in order to understand some waverings in Spinoza's position.
Right. There are a number of questions here on the margin. We are out of time. I really don't know what to do. So against Hobbes, and probably, I don't know about whether acting as Spinoza, I kind of pose this to the general agreement of the assembly, the proposal to take 2 more questions and stay 10 more minutes. Do the speakers agree with this?
Yes.
Yes, I can stick around for a little bit. I have a meeting at 3:30 in about 25 minutes, but.
Claudia?
That's good.
Good. Okay, so assuming that some of those who ask questions are still around, Tammy had a question for a long time. Tammy Naiden.
Thank you. I had a question for Dan.
Good to see you.
Thank you. You too. It's good to see all of you. First of all, thank you for all of the papers. They were all great. I'm really interested in this notion of the state changing the nature of an individual, and it makes sense to me in the sense of the mind as a composite of ideas would change. I'm wondering if it helps to think about a well-run state, either through religion or reason, is going to help direct one's ideas more towards the common good of what's good for humans. And once you leave society, that would remain, right? So I mean, there's that element of, I guess what I'm trying to get at, to go quickly about this, is if we think of as ontology of how we're embedded at different levels of individuation, you know, we're part of the body politic, we're part of the universe, of nature as a whole, and so forth. It seems that's a useful way to think about how our ideas start aligning to what we are part of and identifying with. To the extent that we're identifying as part of a body politic, we're focusing on the common good, which is what is good among humans, which would remain with us in our mind once the state dissolves, I would think, right? So I don't know if that's helpful, but that's what I was sort of thinking as I'm listening to you, to think about both the political and the ontological that Spinoza gives us as a way to make sense of that. And the reason I bring that up is it might be helpful, actually going back to Raphael's question, because then that ultimate original human nature is basically when we're thinking of ourselves as embedded in nature as a whole, right? As part of nature. Getting to one last thing, and then I'll just throw it back to you, sorry. But as you said, Dan, human nature is a funny idea in Spinoza. If we think each individual has a nature, is a certain ratio of motion and rest that's peculiar to that individual, that nature is embedded in the whole of the universe, the state of nature, face of nature, what have you. It seems to me that that's one way to think about how the state helps you get closer to understanding yourself as part of that whole state of nature. I don't know if that is helpful or anything, but I guess my question is, do you see that as helpful to think about the body politic and his ontology in relation to each other in this issue?
Yeah, this is that really interesting connections. I wonder, first of all, I think that there is a clear contrast with Hobbes again, that, you know, for Hobbes, if we don't have a power over us all that forces us to behave well, we're inevitably going to get into trouble. Spinoza, but how it is to sort of articulate the way in which we grow and develop and change by society is subtle, because I think Spinoza's conception of what do you call human nature in Spinoza? You're right, the ratio of motion and rest, the ratio of motion and rest, characterizes each of us as an individual. But, you know, that's true whether we have adequate ideas or inadequate ideas, whether we're rational or not. You're still the same person you are if you're rational or not. On the other hand, there is this common conception of a perfect human nature, which is what he's talking about in the preface to Ethics 4, which is what it is we all strive for. We still remain ourselves, right? But it doesn't look like a conception of, well, maybe it is a conception of human nature for him. I'm not really sure what to say. But what he says about human nature is it seems to be complicated and maybe not altogether coherent, although others may have a different view.
Things are still coming on the chat, so the chat will be a very precious document after we finish. But let me just introduce the last question. Dolores has a question for both Dan and Claudia. Dolores.
So, as always, thank you for wonderful papers. So I'd like Dan and Claudia to think about Hobbes' treatise on man in relationship to the general as it were, genre in the 17th century about treatises on man. So you get Bacon's, he doesn't have a treatise on man, but much of the De Augmentis and advancement of learning is really trying to figure out what the nature of man is. And then Descartes' treatise on man is very, so it feels like the treatise on man in Bacon is more guided by a general idea of natural philosophy and how can we investigate nature and how can we investigate the nature of man in a kind of general sense. But in Descartes, it feels like he's trying to push an idea about the nature of man in a different direction from Bacon and almost as an apologia for the mechanistic philosophy. So I'd like to get your sense about what on earth is Hobbes doing in his treatise on the nature of man when he gives an extensive anatomy of the passions. And I think Dan is right in saying that the entire orientation that Hobbes has post-Civil War completely changes the question about what the nature of man is toward a more political framework. So I wonder if you could speak generally about the extent to which Hobbes is thinking of himself in this genre of Bacon and Descartes, and how and what is he trying to do about this tension between reason and the passions that's going on in Bacon and Descartes, and how he's responding to it both in his treatise on man and the Leviathan. Sorry for such a.
Do you want to begin?
Yes, sure. Well, I think Dan will have more general things to say. I would just emphasize the maybe slightly Baconian theme in that Hobbes definitely thinks that the passions distort right reason, and in fact are one of the main things that distorts right reason, because he thinks that, you know, without them we're a blank slate and they're a source of prejudice, which I guess you can connect with the Baconian theme, although I'm not entirely sure how much Hobbes has Bacon in mind there. I do want to mention here one particular passion, the passion of pride, which is very important in my discussion, because the passion of pride is a misestimation of your epistemic abilities, right? So in this sense, it is one of the most dangerous passions for the prospect of having a civil state, and it is the one you're going to have to work the hardest to keep in control. And I give the floor to Dan.
Thank you. I'm not sure where, well, the De Homina of Hobbes in certain ways actually does correspond to the Traité de l'Homme of Descartes, although Hobbes, at the time that he wrote the De Homina, couldn't have known the Traité de l'Homme. It wasn't published until 1662. And the treatise on man was, the De Homina was published in 1658. The first 2/3 of the treatise on of the De Homina of Hobbes is actually optics, which is interesting. He then goes through, you know, the stuff about the passions and the affects and reason and things like that, which is about the latter third or so. And that's where, and there's a very important chapter on the passions there, which I think actually was a major influence on Spinoza. And Spinoza's account of the passions actually comes much closer to Hobbes's account of the passions than does Descartes. Although I think Hobbes on the passions is in a certain sense answering Descartes. He did know, but it's the passion de l'âme that's really at issue there. And he is, I think, pretty directly addressing that. Of course, his view is very different from Descartes, but he's definitely got, I think, Descartes' view in mind, as does Spinoza, who's again answering Descartes. I think the advancement of learning, or the De Augmentis Scientiarum, is a different kind of work. And I'm not sure where it is. Donna would probably know better than I would where it is in Bacon that you might find the reflections on the passions, for example, and passion and reason that would more correspond to what it is that's in Hobbes, perhaps in the essays would be a place to look for that sort of thing. And remember that Hobbes, I think, was secretary to Bacon and probably worked on the Italian translation, or maybe it was the Latin translation of Bacon's essays before Bacon died. So it's possible that there's some connection that. But Hobbes in the mid-1620s was a very different character, I think, than Hobbes in the 40s and 50s.
Right. Let me exercise some of the Hobbesian authority that I'm invested with in organizing this discussion and moderating this discussion and bring it to a close, because, well, reluctantly so, because there are all sorts of interesting things that have happened in the chat. So Claudia will probably save the chat and send it to each of you who want it.
Please send me an email if you want it.
Yeah, so if you want the chats, the questions in the chat, do send Claudia an email. And now open your cameras, switch on your mics, and let's thank the speakers for this fantastic session, which was absolutely great.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Wonderful conversations.
Right. Next week, we resume our regular time in Europe, I suspect. So we will be back to normal and we will have a session on Descartes. Until then, the very best and stay safe.
Bye.